most people question what we're doing here. We moved from Florida, going in the opposite direction. But grandkids and kids are a big draw, and our grandkids live about 6 miles from where we stand now in Macedonia. So that's why we're here. But this comic strip appeared nationwide in 1971, and the bottom caption is the most important: always listen to the control tower. I cut that out of a newspaper in Erie, Pennsylvania, and kept it ever since, and it's currently framed in my son's home now in Macedonia, who happens to be an air traffic controller as well, and he works in Oberlin, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, how you get an air traffic controller in Oberlin. There's no airport there, but we'll fill you in on those details as we go along here. We have this handy-dandy slide advancer, but I don't want to say it has a trigger finger on it, but it jumps around, so I'll do the best we can. If we jump forward, we'll come back, and hopefully it won't be too bad. There we go. All right, so ATC 101, everything you wanted to know about air traffic control, but we're afraid to ask. And you can ask all the questions you want as we get to the end here. I'm happy to answer them. If I don't know the answer, I'll make something up, and so we'll have answers for everything. Oh, see, there we go, we jumped. Okay, so I wanted to emphasize this presentation's not about me, it's about air traffic control, and that's what I hope to share with you, but I think it's important to add a little context on how I know a little bit something about it. I started my career in air traffic control in the Air Force, spending a year in Vietnam. This is what our control tower looked like at Tuy Hoa Air Base, Republic of Vietnam. That was 1968. It's just a box that holds 2 people. One person can see out, and the other person, you can see kind of the door here if you look closely. He's got the door open so he can see. But you can basically, one person can see out. In July of 1968, out of that little box there, we worked a little over 26,000 aircraft operations in 1 month. And that was condensed into about 12 hours a day, because they basically flew from sunrise to sunset, unless the fighters were scrambled, and then they would fly at night. So 26,000 a month, you condense that into 12 hours a day, you can get pretty busy. And we had 3 parallel runways, we had 5 squadrons of jet fighters, and a couple squadrons of transport aircraft. But just a little background. So I got back from Vietnam in February 1969. By May of 1969, I was working for the Federal Aviation Administration. Started out in Grand Rapids, Michigan, met my bride in Grand Rapids, moved to Chicago. She chased me there, and got married a year or 2 later. So I moved to Chicago from Tuy Hoa. I kind of ended up at Chicago O'Hare, which at the time was the busiest airport in the world. O'Hare was opened, actually dedicated in 1955, but they moved all the commercial traffic from Midway up to O'Hare a few years later in 1962. That was the first control tower right there. They're on their 3rd control tower now. You might have seen the one if you fly through Chicago. There's one adjacent to the terminal. That was the 2nd control tower. I started out in this one, and then about 2 years later moved into the newer one that's right there by the hotel. The floor of this control tower here, where you were standing on the floor, was 198 feet above the ground. That'll come into play later. If we have time, I want to cover one incident we had at O'Hare, and that will have some significance to it. Even in good weather, at 190 feet above the ground, at the world's busiest airport, you couldn't see the whole airport. We actually had some shorter guys, and we had a box that they stood on this box so they could work ground control. The aircraft in the air, of course, were no problem, but to see aircraft that are on the ground 1.5 miles, 2 miles away was difficult from that height. Typically in, there goes the hair trigger. Well, let's see if we can back up here. Okay, so typically in a place like O'Hare, you had anywhere from 4 to 6 air traffic controllers in the control tower, but then you had a radar room down below that had another 8 or 9 controllers. Smaller towers, less busy towers, I should say, might only have 2 or 3 people. But at O'Hare at the time, we had 4 to 6 in the control tower itself and another 8 controllers down in the radar room. So we got a little pre-course test here. Other than Captain White over there, Gene, if you all know Gene, our airline captain, I'm not going to allow him to take this test. He'll know all the answers. But can anybody name at least the identifiers on the top there? Anybody want to take a chance, take a shot at it?
Detroit.
Grand Rapids, yeah. What do you think? So we got Grand Rapids, we have O'Hare, Columbus, Ohio, Detroit Metro. It used to be Detroit Wayne. That's how they came up with the W, Detroit Wayne. St. Louis. Here's a Springfield. Anybody know which Springfield that is? That one's Missouri. SGI would be Springfield, Illinois. This one's Missouri. Denver. Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. Washington National. Pittsburgh. Anybody got a guess at this one? Victorville, California. It's referred to as the Southern California Logistics Airport. It used to be George Air Force Base, and they developed it into a logistic airport in an attempt to get the cargo flights out of LAX and move them out there. It's about 30 miles northeast of Los Angeles. After I retired from the FAA at age 56, I went to work for a couple of contractors, and that's one of the places I worked at. This one here is probably pretty obvious to people, Las Vegas. I worked there as the FAA started contracting out their training functions, and a group called the Washington Consulting Group provided training. And so I headed up the training department there at Las Vegas for a while. Now, if anybody knows this one here, Sue's going to give you a big hug, you know, because that one's a little tough. You don't count. Well, you count, but not for that. Okay, so TNX is the Tonopah test site. Tonopah test site is halfway between Las Vegas and Reno. If I told you much more than that, I'd have to kill you. Okay, it's out in the middle of the high desert. It's where they flew the F-117 stealth fighters before you and I ever knew there was such a thing. The fighter themselves were developed at what is called the Skunk Works in Palmdale, California, Lockheed Martin. And they developed the aircraft, and it was retired in 2008. Now, it was retired because it's such high maintenance, and the technology in it has been incorporated into newer fighters that are less prone to maintenance. So they retired these in 2008. At the time, I was working out at this Tonopah test site on contract with a computer science corporation. They hired, I think, 5 controllers to go out there. If you ever go into Las Vegas, it used to be called McCarran. They just changed the name recently to Harry Reid. But if you look on the opposite side of the airport from the terminal, you might see 5 or 6 Boeing 737s that are all white with a red stripe down the side. No other markings. That's it. If you Googled Janet, J-A-N-E-T, airline, it'll tell you about a secret airline that flies between the Las Vegas airport and out to the middle of the desert in this high desert. There are a number of bases out there. One, you may have heard of Area 51. That's one of them, but they shuttle employees out there on a daily basis, and they have these 5 737s that do that. I would go out on Monday. They'd fly me out there at 8 o'clock on a Monday. I would stay till Thursday. At about noon on Thursday, I'd fly back, and then I'd have the whole weekend again in Las Vegas. This was after I retired from the FAA. So they retired him back to Tonopah, and there was a reason they did that. Most military aircraft are retired to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona because it's dry and they won't deteriorate so fast. This aircraft was retired to the Tonopah test site, and this is an actual photo. It's not Photoshop. You can see the vertical stabilizer here. It was actually painted with the American flag underneath for the last flights. I got to clear the last 18 of these aircraft to land. They brought them back to Tonopah because the hangars at Tonopah are lined with lead. When they were developing this aircraft and nobody knew anything about them, they didn't want any satellites going overhead and photographing the aircraft. So they would store them in these hangars that are lead lined. So as they retired the aircraft, some of the technology is still top secret, even though they retired the aircraft. So they brought all of them back to Tonopah, took the wings off so they could fit them all in the hangars, and that's where they were retired. There were 59 of these aircraft produced, production models. There were 59 of the aircraft produced. Only one was lost in combat, and that was lost in Yugoslavia in 1999. I'm going to whip some numbers on you here, but we're going to go through them fast because that's not the important part. But I want you to get a scope of what the FAA does and what air traffic control does. So we'll just go through these quickly. There will not be a test on it later, so you don't have to take notes. So there's over 19,000 airports within the United States. 5,000 of those are public airports. The other are a variety of private airports. There's a little over 16,000 flights handled by the FAA controllers annually, yearly. Yeah. There we go, jumped on our song. Okay, 45,000 average daily flights handled by the FAA. And almost 3 million passengers fly every day in and out of U.S. airports. In addition to that, there's about 44 billion pounds of freight flown every year. And we have general aviation aircraft. Now, general aviation is what the FAA refers to when you're talking about single-engine aircraft, twin-engine aircraft, pilots that are flying either for recreation or flying for their own business, but they're not firing for compensation or hire, generally speaking. Even if a celebrity has his own jet, might be pretty fancy, might be pretty expensive, but it could be categorized as general aviation. So anyhow, there's another over 25,000 hours of flight done in those general aviation aircraft. And then these are F-35 jet fighters. This picture was taken at Hill Air Force Base, Utah. There's actually 52 of these aircraft on that runway. They do that as a show of force, and I think it was yesterday or the day before, the majority of these aircraft you've seen here were flown to Germany in response to the impending crisis in Ukraine. But that's the most sophisticated Air Force aircraft that they have right now. This maneuver is called an elephant walk. And that name was developed in World War II when they taxied a number of aircraft out at the same time, and it was seen as elephants going nose to tail, going to their next watering hole. So that's how they got the name of an elephant walk. Okay, so how do we keep all these aircraft separated, or at least try to? There's 520 air traffic control towers within the United States. About half of those, we're jumping here. David, you ever figure out this remote here?
That was Lisa.
Yeah. Okay, so there's 520 air traffic control towers within the United States. A little less than half of those are what we call contract towers. In about 1982, the FAA decided, hey, we can do this a little cheaper. We can contract out the least busy of our control towers to private companies, and there's 3 of them, to operate the least busy control towers. So about half of those 520 are what we call contract towers. Now, even though they're not maintained by the FAA and they're not FAA employees, they still have to meet the same certification and medical standards that a controller has to meet if he is working for the FAA. But it's a considerable savings by having these civilian controllers working for a contract company as opposed to a federal employee. So the closest ones to us, where we stand right now, Burke Lakefront is a contract tower. Cuyahoga County is a contract tower. And a little bit further away, OSU has a contract tower. So those controllers have to meet the same standards as an FAA controller, but they're employed by a private company and not the federal government. Now, in addition to that number, there's control towers at military airports as well. So the FAA employs about 14,000 air traffic controllers. Depending on the source you go to or how it changes, a lot of people ask, about 25, somewhere between 29 and 40% are female. And the source of these controllers, when I came in the late 60s and 70s, I think we're all mature enough here to remember those days. There was a lot of people going into the military, either by choice or otherwise. And when we came out of the military, if you were trained as an air traffic controller in the military, you came out, and if you liked what you were doing, if you wanted to continue that career, you would get hired by the FAA. So that was the source in the 60s and 70s. And then when the Vietnam era was over, the military scaled down, the draft went away, there was less people coming out of the military, so that really wasn't much of a source anymore. And today it's not a significant source of air traffic controllers. What we have now is controller training initiatives with 28 institutions of higher learning. Some of those are 2-year colleges, some are 4-year colleges. And if you go to one of these schools, you can get either a 4-year degree or an associate degree, 2-year degree, with a specialty in air traffic control. And that would then allow you to be hired by the FAA, and then you go to the FAA school. All our technical schools for the FAA are in Oklahoma City. So you might go to one of these schools for 2 years or 4 years, get your degree, and then go down to Oklahoma City at what we call the FAA Academy. And that's no guarantee that you're going to make it through the academy. It's a pass-fail, just like it was in the military when you went through their schools. It's strictly a pass-fail. If you pass the particular courses, you got a pretty good job. If you don't, you're out. So after we go through these CTI or controller training initiatives, you still go through the academy, and that's actually the easiest part of the training. They have simulators there, but once you come out of the academy, then you go into on-the-job training at a location. And that's usually the toughest part, where you're working live traffic. And again, it's up or out in the on-the-job training as well. Most people will start out at a slower tower, a Grand Rapids, a Cleveland, and progress on up. Again, I had started at Grand Rapids and then went on to Chicago O'Hare. The success rate is about 50% out in the field, especially at your busier facilities. At the smaller facilities, not quite that severe. But even at Chicago, where we didn't bring anybody in off the street, usually came from another facility, such as a Grand Rapids or a Detroit or a Cleveland. And even at that, the success rate was at about 50%. It's a pretty stringent program. But if you make it, it's a great job. So there's some functions here in the FAA we're going to talk about and kind of get into the meat of the program here. So the functions are flight service stations, where years ago, a pilot would go in and he'd file a flight plan face-to-face with a flight service station specialist. He could get a weather briefing. He could file his route, any questions he wanted answered. That's pretty much gone by the wayside, and it was also contracted out in 2005 by the FAA to Martin Marietta. Martin Marietta had the contract for about 5 years, and it's since changed hands a couple times since then. But it's contracted out, and it's where you file a flight plan. Today it's done either on the phone or on the computer. There's very little face-to-face anymore. The next function would be the air traffic control tower, which most of you are familiar with. If you've gone to the airport, it's visual. You can see the control tower. Terminal radar approach control, or radar room, would be another function, and that almost always used to be correlated with the control tower. It was usually in the base of the control tower, and in most places you worked upstairs and downstairs both. You worked the control tower and you worked the radar room. We went through a couple cycles of that at O'Hare because the radar room is more difficult than the control tower itself. So what we found at O'Hare, when I first got there, you worked both up and down, but that 50% success rate suffered because you had to certify in both facilities. So they split that, And if you made it through the control tower, you could stay in the control tower and just be a controller up there, or you could progress down to the radar room. The incentive was the radar people made more money than people in the control tower. Then there's the Air Route Traffic Control Center, and that's what I mentioned in Oberlin. You could be a controller for 25 years in the FAA, work in one of these Air Route Traffic Control Centers, and never see an airplane. Because it's a big building, and you work on a radar display, there's no airport. You're basically working airplanes at least above 10,000 feet, more than likely flight levels 240 and above at an Air Route Traffic Control Center. Again, we'll talk about that just a little bit more, but the closest one to us is referred to as Cleveland Center, but it's in Oberlin. The one in Chicago is located in Aurora, Illinois, but it's referred to as the Chicago Center. And then the last function is the Air Traffic Control System Command Center. It's Big Brother. It was located in Washington, D.C. for years, but it's now moved out into the Virginia horse fields, and it governs, to a certain extent, aircraft and air traffic movements across the country. Used to be when you took off, they didn't care about the weather where you were going, or they weren't too concerned about it. You took off of Cleveland, you went to O'Hare. Well, if you got to O'Hare and the visibility was down, you might hold and drill holes in the sky for an hour while you were waiting to land. They don't do that so much anymore. It's smarter to keep you on the ground. It saves fuel, probably a little bit safer. So this command center in Virginia determines what the weather is and what the acceptance rate might be at O'Hare. When I was at O'Hare, we typically worked 120 airplanes an hour. So if they determine because of snow removal, because of weather, visibility, whatever you might have, you can't handle 120 airplanes an hour. The airport can't handle 120 airplanes an hour. You can only handle 80. Well, they calculate that back and say, okay, you people in Cleveland, instead of taking off at 8 o'clock like you were scheduled, we need you to take your delay on the ground. So you're not going to depart Cleveland until 8:35. And the theory being that when you get to Chicago, you'll either be able to land as scheduled in that route of flight, or maybe a minimal hold. So that's what that Air Traffic Control System Command Center does. Okay, so this is kind of how it works. Pretty simple. The pre-flight in the top part and the bottom part kind of correlate. You do your pre-flight, so the pilot's pushing back in his aircraft. He's getting everything ready. He's getting his clearance together. He's getting his coffee. He's talking to the control tower. The control tower is going to get him out to the end of the runway. And then he's going to take off, and he's going to talk to that radar room, or TRACON, Terminal Radar Approach Control, TRACON. He'll get up to altitude. Now he's talking to the en route function, or what I refer to as the center, Cleveland Center, Air Route Traffic Control Tower. And then it works the same way when he gets to where he's going. He starts back down here, starts his descent. Now he's talking to that radar room. He's landing, and he's talking to the towers. So you could fly from coast to coast, but you're probably only going to talk to 2 towers. You're going to talk to the tower where you take off, and you're going to talk to the tower where you land. In between, you're going to talk to the Air Route Traffic Control Center. Okay, so our fellow resident, Captain White over here, is going to help me, and we're going to walk you through a little scenario of what it would sound like when you take off, when you taxi your aircraft out at O'Hare and taxi to the runway and take off.
Course delivery United 123 to Chicago to Cleveland.
And that would be the pilot. Could you all hear Gene okay? Okay. So let's try it again, Gene. I think.
Clearance delivery United 123 to Cleveland.
United 123, clear to Cleveland is filed. Maintain 5,000. Expect flight level 240, 10 minutes after departure. Departure control frequency will be 125.0. Squawk 4212.
Roger, ice file. Maintain 5. Expect 240 in 10 minutes. 125.0 and squawk 4212.
Clearance correct. Change of monitor ground 125.75. So what you just heard there was Gene sitting in his cockpit, and he's calling a position and control tower to get his clearance to tell him what route he's going to take to Cleveland, how high he's going to fly, and what frequency he's going to be on. Gene and I slowed it down a little bit so you could kind of understand it, but at a place like Chicago, I mean, it's that fast. And you got to get it the first time. If you don't, you go to the back of the line and everybody else goes ahead of you. You know, they blame a lot on air traffic control, but everybody wants to fly at 8 o'clock in the morning, right? Nobody wants to fly at 8:25 or 8:30. So you got 50 airplanes that want to take off at 8 o'clock, and they can't all take off at 8 o'clock, but they all call for a clearance. And so you have to read it pretty rapidly there. So that was clearance delivery. Now, I'm going to call Gene. He's sitting in his aircraft here. Maybe it's been de-iced. Maybe he's just pushing back. That's what you're looking at here. And that's the layout of Chicago O'Hare when I was there. Since then, they've added a couple runways. Okay, so this is what it was like in the 1970s. So Gene's sitting in his airplane, and now I call Gene and I say, United 123, taxi to runway 32 right, use the outer. Follow the 737 for the right, crossing the bridge, tower 118.3.
Roger, United 123 on the outer, give way to 737, tower 118.3 after crossing the bridge.
Okay, so I told Gene which runway he's going to use, how he's going to get there. And again, pretty simplified there. It can get a lot more complex, but so he's coming out of his gate here. He's going to go on what we call the outer taxiway. There's an inner, there's an outer. He's going to go out here and he's going to cross this bridge. If you've ever been to Chicago, they got the entry going in the air brake goes right under a bridge. He's going over that bridge and then he's going to take off runway 32 right here. So we got him to the runway, or he's at least en route to the runway. Just as gee whiz, if you're not an aviator, these runways are, the way they come up with how they're numbered is magnetic. So runway 32, which is this runway, is heading 320 degrees. If you think of a compass, you're heading 320 degrees. The same piece of concrete, if you're going in the opposite direction, is runway 14, because it's 140 degrees, 320, 140. So that's how runways are numbered. And at places like O'Hare, you have parallel runways. So this runway is 32 right, this runway is 32 left. So we got him to the runway. We told him when he crosses the bridge to change to the tower frequency, 118.3. So now he's at the end of the runway, and a turbine-powered aircraft, you consider him ready to go when he gets to the end of the runway. If you're in a reciprocating aircraft, when you get to the end of the runway, you have to do a run-up. You got to check your mags. You got to do a couple things. So you're not always ready when you get there. But a jet aircraft, the turbine-powered aircraft, when he gets to the end of the runway, that controller considers him to be ready to go. So we don't wait for the pilot to call us. We just, when he gets to the end of the runway and it's his turn, then we just tell him, United 123, turn right, heading 030, runway 32 right, clear for an immediate takeoff or hold short. Traffic 1.5 miles on final.
Roger, 123, clear for immediate takeoff, right turn 030.
So I just cleared him for takeoff. He's going to turn right. He's coming off 320 heading to the northwest. He's going to turn right to 030. He's going to climb to 5,000 like I told him before. And I also told him, hey, don't dilly-dally. Don't be sitting there saying your beads. You know, you're cleared for an immediate takeoff. There's somebody 1.5 miles on final. You know, if you don't get going, it's going to be an ugly day for both of you. So Gene's acknowledged. Gene says, okay, I can take that immediate takeoff. Now, he has the option. I'm cleared him for an immediate takeoff. If he's not ready, if he's not comfortable with that, he can come back and say, United, I think I'll just wait. Now, a place like that at O'Hare, you're not going to be real happy with Gene because there's another 8, 9, 10 airplanes waiting to go behind him. But he has that option to say, no, I don't think that's safe. I'm not going to do that. But at Chicago, you commonly ran airplanes on final 1.5 miles apart. So you didn't have a whole lot of room for air there. And a lot of it depends on the wind and the runway condition and so forth. But basically, you got an airplane coming in 1.5 miles apart all day long in Chicago. So thank you, Gene. Excellent job. You haven't lost a thing in a couple. Thank you. Good job. All right, so now he's airborne. And it gets, I tell him he gets airborne. Our book says, we got a book about that big, tells you how to do things, right? Our book says when he gets airborne and he's 1 mile from the airport, you tell him to contact departure control. And that was that terminal radar approach control radar unit I was telling you about. At Chicago, Sometimes we paid attention to that book, sometimes we didn't. But the way I was taught, when that pilot has enough time to raise his gear, he's got enough time to change his frequency. So we didn't wait till he was a mile away. When he was midfield and he was sucking up his gear, we told him to contact departure, and I tell him to contact departure control, and he already has the frequency. So that's when he goes to this TRACON that we talked about. Now, this is the Chicago area. That radar room, when I was there, was right in the base of the control tower. Like I say, it changed over the years on how we could certify people or not certify them, but we both worked up and down. Today, that radar room is located in Elgin, Illinois, which is about 30 miles away from Chicago O'Hare. And it not only works Chicago O'Hare, and as we did when I was there, when we were in the same building, you also worked Midway and all the airports that are within that red line there. You didn't just work the one airport, you worked everything within that airspace. So in this case, they'd be working O'Hare and Midway, Waukegan, Gary, Indiana, a number of other smaller airports around the area. There's a similar TRACON in the Washington, D.C. area now. I worked at Washington National and Dulles airports, but they call that the Potomac TRACON. It's out in the, like I say, out in the horse country of Virginia, and it handles Washington National, Baltimore, Andrews Air Force Base, even down to Richmond. So they handle all the aircraft within that airspace. So once he goes through this area, then he's going to talk to one of the, well, let's see. Okay, so the FAA right now, and all the stuff is pretty current. I updated it before our presentation here, but the FAA says there's 147 of these terminal radar approach controls around the country. They do it in a cartoon style. I don't know for sure why they do that, but this is what it would actually look like. That would be 4 radar displays in a typical terminal radar approach control. These are actual radar displays, and many of those have been changed out now, and those that have not been, they're actually doing away with the actual radar display and replacing them with a computer monitor. And that computer will take a number of radar sites and mosaic into that computer display. So these round radar displays are now being replaced with just a square computer monitor, maybe a little bit larger than the one you have at home. So after he's done talking to these people, he's going to talk to that Air Route Traffic Control Center we talked about, and that would be Chicago, and you can kind of see the area that Chicago Center would cover. There's 25 of these air traffic control centers around the country, and those are the boundaries you see there. This is typically what an Air Route Traffic Control Center looks like. That's the building, and they're all kind of the same way. They built them the same way, must have the same contractor. But you can see here, if you took off from Cleveland, here's Cleveland Air Traffic Control Center here. This might be a better view. Let's see if I can get it to go forward. Okay, now. There we go, yeah. One more time. It's not going to let me do it, huh? All right, stop. Okay, here we are. Here's the Cleveland Air Route Traffic Control Center space here in the green. You can see all these centers start with a Z. Some of them are pretty easy to identify. That would be Salt Lake City. That would be the Denver Center. That would be the Kansas City Center. That would be the Memphis Center, Atlanta, Jacksonville. So ZOB doesn't make that much sense unless you already heard me say that it's located in Oberlin. So that's why it's ZOB. But anyhow, you could take off from Cleveland, and let's say you're going down to Orlando. So you would go down, probably come from Cleveland, Detroit area, probably go through Indianapolis Center, the Atlanta Center, then Jacksonville Center, and then talk to Orlando Tower down here. MCO, that makes sense, right, for Orlando. Used to be McCoy Air Force Base. That's what the MCO comes from. So this is the last segment there that we talked about, the big brother that oversaw the whole country. It's national in scope, and they implement what they call flow control measures. When there's a runway down, an accident, weather, low visibility, they restrict the traffic that is moving so you don't get to your destination and have to drill holes in the sky. This is called a traffic situational delay. Again, this facility is located in Warrenton, Virginia. And right there you see those are actual live aircraft on that display. It's probably earlier in the day when this was taken, and I say that because of the traffic over here on the East Coast and a lesser amount of traffic on the West Coast. I'm not going to cover 9/11 today because we probably won't have enough time, but Susan has asked if there's enough interest, and we'll leave that up to you. You can tell Susan if you're interested or not. I can do a separate presentation on 9/11, at least my experience in the Pittsburgh TRACON. I'm not an expert on 9/11, but I was in the radar room in Pittsburgh when United 93 flew through, and I could tell you about the aftermath and what we did with airplanes and so forth. I mention that now only because when 9/11 happened, the display looked something similar to this. Within 10 minutes, we had landed 5,000 aircraft and across the country now. And then within 2 hours, this same display was almost void of any targets. I mean, you can Google it. Google air traffic control or 9/11, something of that, and eventually you can get to a video that displays a time lapse of before 9/11 and as we progress for the next 2 hours. And in 2 hours, that screen there were a couple dots on it, but mostly military aircraft that had been scrambled. But for the most part, at that point, it was dark. So to keep this system functioning, there's about 65,000 pieces of equipment that got to operate 365 days a year, 24 hours, 7 days a week. And we have about, I keep saying we, I'm no longer part of the FAA, but the FAA has 6,000 specialists to maintain that equipment. One of the exciting things about being in this career field was the advancement, and it was always something new. As I said, we had this book that we had to abide by that was probably 3 inches thick, and it was changed every 6 weeks. You got an amendment to it every 6 weeks. Didn't change the whole book, but paragraphs within that book were changed every 6 weeks. So that was kind of the exciting part of the job. You're always learning new things and new technology. So up here is probably, certainly before my time, but probably, I would say in the 50s, where they're working flat scopes, radar displays. You can't see it real well, but they're using what they call shrimp boats. They had a little plastic thing with the aircraft name on it, and as that target went across that screen, they would push this shrimp boat along to show where it was. Now, this en route traffic covers like 200 miles, so the airplanes relatively seem to move slower because of the distance. In what we call the terminal function, which is what I worked in, you're generally working about a 40-mile screen, so those blips went a lot faster because you were working 40 miles rather than 200 miles. And you couldn't use the shrimps in the terminal because they moved too fast, and you just couldn't move the strips that fast. Just as an example, at Chicago, in our radar room, we would have no less than 8 people all working at the same time. And probably from 7 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. Sometimes it ran later if there was weather, but roughly from 7 in the morning to 10 o'clock at night. Each one of those 8 controllers were working 8 aircraft apiece, constantly. When that one airplane landed, your handoff man, the guy next to you, gave you another one. So you were working 8 airplanes all the time. And prior to 1972, there were no alphanumerics. The only thing the controller was looking at was a little slash. And the controller had to remember who that was, how fast he was going, what his altitude was, and he had to keep that all in his head on these airplanes that were moving around the other people that had 8 airplanes. So you got to be, you had to focus. But through the advancement, primary radar was developed in World War II. You send out a pulse, it hits something, it comes back. And I say it hits something. Might be an airplane, might be a mountain. You don't know what it was, it hit something. And you got a lot of ground clutter because of that in mountainous area. When I was in Vietnam, you know, the poor Army helicopter pilots, they gave them minimal training. You know, they taught him how to get a helicopter up and how to get it down, not a whole lot more than that. You know, so you'd have this helicopter pilot call you maybe in the middle of the monsoon, might be 25, 30 miles away. There might be 2 or 3 mountains between you and him, and he'd call you and say, you know, dust off 1, 2, to approach control. Can you help me? Well, we couldn't because we couldn't see him. It's line of sight. We couldn't see him on the other side of that mountain. So that's what primary radar was about. Then you had the secondary radar came in about the end of World War II, and it was initially called IFF, Identification Friend or Foe. And you would tell the pilot of an aircraft to dial in a transponder code, a 4-digit number. You heard me read it to Captain White over there when I said 4215. So you would tell that aircraft squawk a number, maybe 4215, and this technology would send out a pulse, and it would only pulse and interrogate that number. So if it interrogated 4215, then it would come back and put 2 slashes on your scope instead of 1. So identification friend or foe, World War II, that's when they told these are good guys coming back or they're not good guys coming back. But in civilian aviation, they used it to help to identify aircraft, and it helped to eliminate some of that ground clutter. Not only did you have mountains, but weather. If you had heavy precipitation, could completely clutter your screen. You couldn't pick out an aircraft in there. So the secondary radar would have these 2 pulses, and you could turn down the radar to eliminate that weather or at least reduce it and still be able to see a target of the aircraft. About 1972, Sperry Rand developed the automated radar tracking system, and this was neat stuff. Now I didn't have to remember the aircraft call sign. I didn't have to remember how high he was, and I didn't have to remember how fast he was going. This automated system would use this 4-digit code and actually put a data block on that target for me. And when it would tell me you'd be United 123, it would show you that he was at 5,000 feet and he was doing 180 knots. So I didn't have to remember all that stuff anymore. Put it on the screen and it followed that target. So that came in about 1972. There's been some modification to that between over the next 20, 30 years, but now what is coming in is automated dependent surveillance, and it's satellite-based. So that's going to eliminate all the problems of ground clutter and mountain because it's shooting from above and it's going to pick those aircraft up. And it's being implemented across the country, or across the world, actually, not just across the country. It's required in all commercial aviation starting back in 2020 is when they required that be installed. So it's being phased in the aviation worldwide, and that will use navigation from the satellites as opposed to ground-based radar. Now, regardless of all these improvements, all the decisions are made by a human. None of these decisions are being made by these computers. It's just an aid. It's helping us remember where that airplane is, how high he is, helps us in emergency situations. You may have read, you may have heard during 9/11, you know, that the transponder was disabled by the hijackers. They can put in a special code on that 4-digit transponder I was telling you about, and that tells the controller he's being hijacked. And then we have this big book that tells us what to say and not to say. You know, you don't want to come back and say, United 123, you being hijacked? You know, it spoils the whole movie. So it tells us what we should say and what we shouldn't say. Same thing if there's an emergency. He can dial in 7700. That tells us he's having an emergency. Maybe he's got time to talk to us, maybe he doesn't. But we know he's an emergency and we're going to handle him in a specific way. Same thing if he loses his radio. He has a code, a 4-digit code, that he could dial in there, and on our screen it will show radio loss. It'll probably even flash at us so that we know he can't talk to us. Maybe he can hear us, maybe he can't, but we know he can't talk to us. So then again, we handle him in a specific way. But this ADS, automated dependent surveillance, and automated means the pilot doesn't have to do anything. The dependent just means it's dependent upon him having that equipment in the aircraft. But that's the latest, and it'll be coming in ever so quickly now. So you want to be an air traffic controller, right? This is what you got to do. It's best career in the world. I know everybody wants to sign up. If you haven't reached your 31st birthday, we can give you a job. But here's the basic qualifications to be an air traffic controller. You got to be a United States citizen, be age 30 or under at the closing date of the application. So periodically, the FAA will put out an opening and say, okay, we're hiring air traffic controllers. And that's what it means by this closing date. If you're age 30 or under, then you can apply. You have to pass a medical exam, which is the same exam basically that an airline pilot has to pass. You have to pass a security investigation. You got some pre-employment tests. You need to speak English clearly so that you can be understood in communications. You can see they hired me anyway. But English is the language of aviation worldwide. Everybody is supposed to be able to speak and understand English. Some carriers, foreign carriers to us, I guess I would say, foreign carriers here, some are better than others. You know, your KLMs, your Lufthansas and that, they're all excellent. That's not an issue. But you have some other third world countries or Mexicana always seem to be a problem communicating with them. But English is the language. And then the last qualification, 3 years of progressively responsible work experience or a bachelor's degree or a combination of those. So most people kind of ask a question here, why age 30? There's public law that was passed in 1972 that says you have to retire when you're 56. A pilot can fly, an airline pilot can fly till he's 65. Used to be 60, and that was changed a few years ago to 65. But an air traffic controller has to retire when he's 56. So by requiring that we don't hire anybody over 30, that allows the person to get 25 years of service. If he's 31 and 25, he retires when he's 56. So back in late 60s, I assume, early 70s, somebody at a higher pay grade than I was determined that at age 56, you started to lose some faculties that allowed you to think quickly, to multitask, all of those things. So 56 was a good age to say you can't do this anymore. So that's why the age 56 and the age 31. Now, I said that the military doesn't supply that many candidates anymore just because of the sheer numbers of people coming out of the military are not what they used to be. So they have these controller training initiatives at 4- and 2-year colleges. There's one at Kent State, would be the closest to us here. They have a 4-year program with expertise in air traffic control. Next closest one would be the Community College of Beaver County, just outside Pittsburgh. And they happen to be the first school that the FAA partnered with to do this kind of training. So let's see here. Before we get into questions here, if I can quickly, I'd kind of like to illustrate to you how it's critical the pilot and a controller are on the same page and they speak the same language. In the absence of one word, well, I guess we didn't talk about training too much at Oklahoma. We do all our training in Oklahoma City. All the technical training is done at Oklahoma City. Bookwork, simulation, and the real guts of the training is on the job training once you get out to the field. And it can be pretty intense. I think it's a lot kinder now than what it used to be. It used to be, you know, if you're weak, it was like a shark smelling blood in the water. You know, they kind of went through for your throat. But it's a little bit more politically correct now. So much for that, I guess. Yeah, we'll move on here. We'll come back to that. Okay, this is what I wanted to demonstrate, how one word can make a big difference. This was an actual accident that happened in Chicago O'Hare, and it was in December of 1972, 6 o'clock at night. The weather at Chicago that day was a ceiling of 200 feet, visibility a quarter mile, and fog. 200 feet above the ground was the ceiling. If you weren't asleep when I was talking earlier, I said the base of the control tower was 198 feet. That was the floor, okay? So I'm 6'1". So that means pretty much my heads were in the clouds, right? So 200-foot ceiling, 190, another 60, yeah. My head was in the clouds. So at O'Hare, and unique to O'Hare, I went to a number of places in supervisory positions after O'Hare, and they would always say, well, you know, you're no Superman. What's the big deal with O'Hare, you know? Well, I'd wait for a day like this when the 200-foot ceiling, quarter-mile visibility, they're sitting there drinking coffee, eating donuts, 1 or 2 airplanes every hour. I said, here's the difference. If you were at Chicago right now, you'd be working 120 airplanes an hour. Even though you had a 200-foot ceiling and a quarter-mile visibility, you're still working 120 airplanes an hour. That's the difference. So anyhow, it was one of those days, and I had worked a day shift on this day. Luckily, I got off at 3 o'clock, but I can remember, because of the events that happened after I left, it was like working in a snow globe. I mean, you really couldn't see anything. You couldn't see the airplanes you were talking to, certainly. You had ground radar, which in those days was pretty sketchy. You could tell when an airplane turned off the runway, but that was about it. You couldn't really see them when they were taxiing. It was just your knowledge of this airfield and relying on what the pilot told you. Okay, so get back to the point what one word being omitted could mean. And in this case, it meant about 10 lives and about 25 severe injuries. We had a Delta 954, which was landing on this 14 left. He was a Convair 880, not that that makes much difference to you, but a 4-engine jet aircraft. He was landing on 14 left. And he landed, and as was common the case in those days, they would land and they might not have a gate. Delays, weather, the departure didn't get out of the gate, so this guy couldn't get into the gate. We had what we call penalty boxes. He turned off the runway, said, I don't have a gate. Say, okay, go to the penalty box. Those penalty boxes started filling up, and that was the situation here. Delta 954 landed 14 left, and he got to the end and he turned off, and he called the ground controller now, who can't see him, who's 3 or 4 foot into the cloud, right? He can't see him, but Delta tells him I'm off 14 left. And I don't have a gate. Okay, so the controller assumes that he's right here, right at the end of 14 left. And there's a run-up pad here called 32 right. Here's where we're getting to that one word. Delta calls ground control, says ground control, Delta 954, I'm departing 14 left and I don't have a gate. Ground control comes back, says Delta 954, pull into the 32 pad. We left out one word there. He didn't say 32 right. Yeah. He just said 32, okay? So assume, A-S-S-U-M-E, if you will, the controller assumes that Delta is right here, and he's going to park there. Wrong. Delta has already passed that 32 pad. He's down here. So Delta assumes he means 32 right. Controller can't see him. Pilot can't see the taxiways, really. He can't see anybody else. So Delta keeps trucking on down here. He's going down here to 32 left. Well, at the same time, North Central, 575, a DC-9, he's taxiing for departure. And he's coming out here, and he's going to go to 27 left. You see what's starting to develop right here? So he gets to 27 left. The local controller, Lloyd Eastburn, best controller I've ever seen, I couldn't keep up with him. That was the only problem with Lloyd, is he thought so quickly, the people around him just couldn't keep up. I couldn't, and I consider myself a pretty good controller, but I couldn't keep up with Lloyd. He just thought so fast, I just couldn't keep up with him. Anyhow, Lloyd's working, and Lloyd says, I don't have a quarter-mile visibility, stops the departures, which is what he's supposed to do. Got to have a quarter mile to take off. So these airplanes are sitting out here now waiting to go on 27 left. North Central's the first one. Supervisor gets up from his desk, puts down his racing form, looks out the window and says, you got a quarter mile. What are all these airplanes doing here? Let's get them rolling. Lloyd says, okay. You say, we got a quarter mile? We got a quarter mile. So North Central here, clears North Central for takeoff on 27 left. Here comes Delta. Left out that one word. Left out 32 right. Delta's crossing the runway. North Central takes off. North Central can't see him here. Quarter mile visibility in fog. He can't see him crossing the runway. And Delta can't see that they're taking off on 27 left. They can't see each other. They don't have the visibility for it. So the inevitable in this case happens at this intersection. North Central hits the vertical stabilizer of the Convair 880. Minor injuries on Delta. No big deal on Delta. However, North Central, once he hits that vertical stabilizer, goes back down into 27 left. and they had 10 fatalities on that aircraft, and a fire that destroyed the airplane. The good thing is quite a number of people got off the DC-9, but 10 perished. At that time, there may be more now, but at the time there were 3 fire stations on O'Hare. The first thing the control tower knew about it, again, they're in the clouds, they can't see it. They don't see the fire, they don't see the crash. Next aircraft that lands over here on 14 right, because they're landing 14 right and 14 left, okay? And they're taking off on 27 left and 9 left. That's how they move 120 airplanes an hour. They do it on 4 runways and they cross. So the next aircraft that lands here on 14 right, he says, Tower, you got a problem. There's people out here running around. Well, you don't have people running around on an airport, right? So that's the first thing the control tower knew, there was an accident. Hit the crash phone, fire department comes out, and they initially see the the debris of the north central DC-9 right here, and it's on fire. They see that, but they can't even see the conveyor down here and all the debris down here because of the visibility. It took minutes before they realized there was another aircraft involved. They didn't know there were 2 aircraft involved. So I use this illustration not to scare you. I hope I didn't scare you, but I wanted to point out that's the critical nature of it. He left out one word. Yeah, that controller came back to work for 1 day in about 6 months, got sick to his stomach, and never came back to work again. So the absence of one word, that's what it took. So anyhow, that's my spiel, and usually the best part of these discussions or question and answers. I hope you have some. If I don't have an answer, I'm going to make one up. So anybody?
Oh, hold on, I'll bring you the mic.
You mentioned that the DC Center was moved out into Virginia someplace. Exactly where?
Warrenton. Warrenton, yeah.
Warrenton.
It used to be right down DC, but they ran out of space. They moved it out to Warrenton.
Thank you.
Yep. I think there was a question up here.
There's still a 1,000 feet separation flying east and west?
Yeah, basically 1,000 feet and 3 miles is the standard, but that's changed over the years based on types of aircraft. For instance, what we call a heavy jet, which 747 and others, but a heavy jet based on his gross weight produces a lot more turbulence behind the aircraft, what we call wake turbulence. So for instance, although we would normally vector aircraft 3 miles apart, behind a heavy jet, we have to have 5 miles. But the 1,000 feet vertically is a general rule, not a solid rule, but generally 1,000 feet between airplanes or 3 miles. As you get closer, if the weather's good, you can reduce both of those down to about 1.5 miles. But 1,000 feet vertical is a good standard, yes.
Were you around during the 1981 strike of the air traffic controllers? And
nobody
what were
ever
the
asked
issues?
that question, right?
That's the first one I asked
I was at
him
a
when I met
men's
him.
lunch today, and that was the topic of discussion. So if any of you that were here, you know the answer, and don't catch me in a lie here, but yes. August 3rd, 1981, everybody remembers that as an air traffic controller. There's a lot to that story. Not to get into politics if you're a union person or a non-union person, but President Reagan supported PATCO, Professional Air Traffic Controllers Association, when he was running for election, and they supported him and were disappointed when they all got fired. But they negotiated a contract, and the union leadership agreed to the contract with the federal government. But then they turned around and went back to their membership and told them to vote it down. I think we can get more. Well, Reagan and his administration, of course, said, hey, you reneged on the deal. You agreed to this contract. And then they backed out of it. But a little bit more background to that the controllers union had been threatening for years. And even preceding August 3rd, 1981, in just the months prior to that, they threatened 3 different times. And I was a manager at that time, and I had to, in Springfield, Missouri, we had 18 controllers, and each of those 3 times leading up to the strike, we had to call in each controller individually with his union representative, and we would say, you remember this oath that you signed when you hired on with the FAA saying you would not participate in an illegal strike against the federal government? And they would have to sit there till they acknowledged that, yes, I did sign that, and say, okay, next. And I did that 3 times before they went on strike. So it wasn't a surprise. They just didn't think that President Reagan would do it. It took about a year later before we went to federal court. Our jurisdiction was in St. Louis from Springfield, Missouri. And I had to go there with each of the 14 of the 18 that went on strike. And it was a very quick process. The judge would call up the controller, ex-controller, and say, is this your signature here? Controller would say yes, and the judge would say next. You know, it was pretty simple. So yeah, that was August 3rd, 1981, 14,000 controllers were fired. A little history there, I've done some reading on that ever since, and it goes beyond aviation. From what I read, and I choose to believe it, the Russians thought Reagan was just a pretty face. He was an actor, and they weren't too concerned about President Reagan. They thought he was a softie. But when they saw him fire 14,000 of his own employees, they said, well, maybe we better start taking this guy more seriously. At the same time, the U.S. Postal Service was negotiating their contract, and they were waiting to see what was going to happen with the controllers. And as soon as August 3rd, 1981 happened, the Postal Service settled pretty quickly. Yeah. Did I answer your question? Or? Yes. Okay.
What did they do with that 14,000?
The question was, what did they do when they fired 14,000 controllers? First of all, they restricted air traffic. You know, general aviation in the United States is rare, but they can fly whenever, wherever they want to. You don't find that in most countries. But here in the United States, general aviation, if you got an airplane, you can go out and fly. Well, the first thing they did was restrict that. You now had to have a reservation to fly, and for the first month, they didn't get any reservations. And the airlines were cut back also. So the first thing they did was restrict flight down to a manageable number. And that went on for a year and a half. But in Springfield, we had 4 controllers that did not go on strike. And they closed towers even smaller than Springfield, like Cape Girardeau, Missouri, or Joplin, Missouri. They closed those, and what controllers didn't go on strike at those towers, those 2 specifically, we brought those controllers into Springfield to pump up the complement to handle the traffic. Now, they also brought in some military controllers, which helped, but basically they did kind of administrative duties like the clearance delivery that Captain White and I went through, not working live traffic necessarily, but still taking over some duties to relieve controllers to work the live traffic. Yeah, so that's how it was handled.
Yeah, this is a general aviation question in terms of the monitoring of general aviation, say in the mid-'70s. I was flying on a project with the Corps of Engineers, and it was a small plane. The door fell off while we were mid-flight, and they just kept flying. And I don't know, would they have been obliged to tell the control tower or whoever they were probably out of the general control of a specific airport, or do you not monitor the general?
Obliged, no. They wouldn't have been obliged to. Yeah. I think it would be probably smart to, but they weren't obliged to. And they could have been operating in and out of what we call an uncontrolled airport. I mean, out of those numbers I showed you, how many airports are in the United States, the non-public ones are primarily what we call uncontrolled. There's no control tower. Pilots just fly in and out of there. They announce their position. You know, I'm turning final for runway 32, and that's it. So it could have been an uncontrolled airport, but they would not be obliged, no. Yeah.
Rich, what sort of redundancies do they have if you guys get hacked or you lose power? I just wondered, how do you get backup?
Power is an easy answer. All the radar rooms have at least one engine generator that is completely fueled at all times. So losing electrical power is normally not an issue. that it's an automatic kickover. As soon as it loses, the engine generator kicks on. You might see a blip, you might not even. So power's not an issue. There's redundancy there. There's 2 channels on the radar, so if one channel went down, the other would kick in. At a place like Chicago, there's multiple radar sites. For instance, we had one right in the center of O'Hare, the radar, but we also had one at Midway. So if one of those went out, might not be an ideal situation, but you still had radar coverage. If you were at someplace that didn't have that redundancy, there are non-radar procedures in which aircraft can be controlled without the use of radar, much, much slower, much less efficient, but safe.
Are there any changes in how the air traffic is handled when a military aircraft is sharing the same space, same airspace?
Generally, no. The military's handled just like the civilian. It's primarily a first-come, first-served basis, unless it's an emergency situation. In this book we talked about outlines those. For instance, an aircraft has a certain call sign. If he's transporting, say, an organ for transplant, he uses a certain call sign and he gets priority. There are other similar things, and there are things for certain militaries, broken arrow type exercises where they would get priority. Certainly Air Force One gets priority, but generally speaking, no, the military flies by the same standards and the same kind of first come, first served basis. Yeah.
It's such a stressful job. How did you stay in it that long?
The question is a common one. It's a stressful job. My answer has always been every job has its stress. I don't know what you all did for a living, but I got a paycheck every other Tuesday. It was a decent paycheck. I didn't have to worry about getting laid off or fired unless I really screwed up or had a medical issue. That I think I covered that briefly, but that's kind of a big issue. So it wasn't so stressful for me. I knew I was going to get a paycheck and I could feed my family every other week. If I had been selling real estate or selling cars, I might have had an ulcer as big as a basketball. So it can be stressful, but it has its moments. I can't imagine doing anything else. If I wasn't an old fart, I'd be doing it now. I couldn't pass the physical. I wear a hearing aid, maybe because I wore a headset on my left ear for most of my working life. That might have caused the hearing loss, I don't know. But if I could still be doing it, I would. My son does it now. I have a brother that's 16 years, my junior. He did it until just a couple of years ago when he reached 56 and he had to retire. So yeah, it can be stressful, but it's a great job. It's a lot of satisfaction, especially when the weather's crappy. When it's down to 200-foot ceiling at a quarter mile, that's when it's the best. Because you're doing something. I mean, that pilot is going to have issues if you're not there to help him. When the weather's good, you know, when you can see 30 miles, you can see the runway, for most part, those airplanes aren't going to run into one another. You know, he can see the other guy. He's not going to run into him. But when the weather's down, he can't see the other guy. So it's pretty critical on what you're doing. Yes, sir.
Related question, how long a stretch would you normally be on there before you get off that screen?
The union contract says 2 hours. It depends a lot on your staffing, but basically you would work live traffic for 2 hours, then you would get a break, depending on what your staffing was like. Maybe it'd be 20 minutes, maybe it'd be 40 minutes, depending on how the staffing was and the traffic was. But generally speaking, no more than 2 hours. At O'Hare, when I was at O'Hare, we were all kids. I mean, you didn't have anybody 30 years old at O'Hare. I mean, now you're talking about your dad, if he's 30 years old. We were all, you know, I was 22 years old. And that was the mean age, and we were just having a great time, you know? I mean, it was, being a controller at O'Hare was like being at the Super Bowl. I mean, it was the world's busiest airport, and we were just having a great time. So they would have a hard time prying off a position in an hour, because the busiest position was approach control, and there was 2 of them, one east, one west. We parked in the middle of the airport at the firehouse and rode our own little shuttle bus into the terminal so we didn't have to park out with everybody else. And we would literally run into the radar room with our little lunch bucket and our Coke still on and run into that radar room and try to get that busiest spot, because that guy was going home. And I'd say, Dick, who's following you? And Dick would say, I'm going home. So I'd sit down, Coke still on, my lunch bucket right here so I could get that busiest position. The next guy that came off the bus, he'd say, Rich, who's following you? And I say, you are. And that's how we would establish that line for the rest of the day. The supervisor never had to say, hey, you go work that position. He might have to say, well, you go work ground control or something where it's less busy, because everybody wanted to work. That was just, we were all young kids having a good time, and yeah, 2 hours was the limit, but if we could get away staying longer than we did, yeah, it was a good job. Yes, sir.
Back here.
Well, wait a minute. We got a microphone back here, Paul. Hang on a minute.
John and I got the order.
At what age did you get interested in this career, and what motivated you?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. What age, what?
What age did you get interested in this career, and what motivated you to go this way?
Well, my wife might tell that story. I don't know, Sue. I don't know how I got interested in it, but I can tell you the story, and it's true. And I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania. Remember the old dial telephones? Remember those had a dial on it? You picked up the thing and these two little buttons popped up and you're alive, right? I can remember at some age taking a butter knife, taping it down over those two buttons so they wouldn't pop up, and that was my crash phone. and I had an ice cream scooper. Remember those little scoopers? That was my microphone. And, I was probably 18, 19, I don't know. No, just, I don't know what age, but I had an interest for it. I got into the Air Force. Luckily, you took an aptitude test and you're placed in certain blocks. And if you were in this block, you could select these. And I scored well, but they needed controllers at that time. I could have scored well, but if they needed cooks, I would have been a cook. So I got to be a controller, and that's my story anyhow.
There was one map that you put up. It was color-coded for various districts, and all of the coastline was white, not appearing to not be a part of any district. What was the significance of the coastline being excluded?
Let's see if we can find that slide, Paul. Not that one, huh? That one?
Yes.
It was one like that, only the whole coastline. East to west, south, that.
Oh, I think that's just the water. That's the outline of the United States there, and the white part is just water. I think they're just showing the geography here. That's the coastline. But the water over here would still be under the control of Washington Center or New York Center or Boston Center. Okay.
You showed some pictures of some airports with a tower early on, and there was one with a mountain. Was that Portland?
I don't know. I don't know.
Well, it looked like Mount Hood. That's why I was wondering.
Well, let's say it was Portland.
Okay.
That was a tower with the mountains in the back of Portland. I told you, I could lie with a straight face.
You forecasted it, though. You should have went with it.
Related to the earlier question, how is it handled across open water? Do you have radar ships? It is now done by satellite. And why have some of the planes gone down without being able to be found at all?
Well, all of those were overseas someplace. I don't know. But those are now in this transition where the satellites will pick up that traffic. But up until now, and continuing until that's fully implemented, they simply had standard routes. And depending on the atmospheric pressure and the wind would determine which routes those flights, say, going to Europe would be on or coming back. And based on the wind, atmospheric conditions, and so forth, you might have more or less airplanes in those tracks. So it could delay airplanes depending on the weather and the atmospheric conditions. But it was strictly non-radar, strictly by rote that you fly this route and we're going to count on people like Captain White to fly that route, and it's just trust. We tell him to fly this route, and he says, I'm doing it, and he checks into certain reporting points, but that will all become a thing of the past, hopefully, when all this satellite navigation kicks in.
Okay, I had a question. I don't know somebody, oh, I was, it's sort of, you covered part of it, I think, with this last one, but if planes are leaving the US and they're going over the Pacific or the Atlantic, how do you keep in touch with them, or do you not?
There are certain limitations, but you keep in touch with them for quite a while, and then there's relay sites that they can relay traffic information back to control centers, but it's not as direct communications as what you would normally have within the United States. Sometimes not direct pilot to controller communications, and it's delayed. But it's not as critical because you have more, you compensate for that by having more separation. They're not 3 miles apart out there over the ocean. Yeah, there may be, you know.
I've noticed over the years that the towers are getting taller and taller. I assume that's so they can see better?
Yes, because the airports are getting larger and larger and more expansive. It's like the one at O'Hare, the one that I said the floor was 190. You know, that was open in 1955 or whatever, and O'Hare was much smaller. As they expanded, in order to see out beyond, they raised the heights of the tower, yeah.
Other questions?
Uh-oh, now this could be a good one. This comes from an airline pilot.
This is a plant.
I can't lie about this one.
Rich, I want to thank you for this presentation. I learned a lot today that I didn't know.
Wow.
And one thing you haven't covered, though, normally it's nice to sit there in my nice warm cockpit having coffee, but then every now and then a door falls off, or I have a medical emergency, or I'm in a holding pattern and say, I don't have enough fuel to stay here. I want to go to Peoria. No, well, can't make Peoria. How about Rockford? How do you cover all these? Do you have the staffing to tap the guy next to you and say, you cover this section now while I'm busy? It was always amazing to me that if I had a medical emergency on board, you cleared me there, cleared everything out pretty much.
Right.
Or if I had, like I said, organ transplant, I got priority. Or if you had coffins on board coming back from Vietnam, they got special priority. But how do you cover all these extra things?
I don't know that I have a good answer for that, Gene. We just did. I mean, if you had an emergency, you know, nothing was going to be in your way. And we just cleared them out of your way. And like I say, there's a lot of camaraderie in these radar rooms. I mean, especially at a place like O'Hare. I mean, everybody just worked together and you did whatever you needed to do to make it work. And if I had a situation like that, an emergency, you know, I would just yell out, hey, I got United 123's got 20 minutes of gas left. I got to get them on the ground. And everybody would just, you know, get out of your way. But it was sectorized. In other words, very simple. When an airplane first took off at Chicago, he was stopped at 5,000 feet. That's because the arrivals were coming in at 6,000 feet. And then once you got them on radar and you had room to climb this departure around the arrival, you would. So it was sectorized, and each person that had his 8 airplanes knew where his airspace was, and without coordination, he needed to stay in that airspace. But to coordinate, you could make anything happen. And it just, I hate to give you, it was just the skills of the controllers and the willingness to do it, and it just got your blood pumping if you had something like that, or, hey, we're bringing back a load of people from.
This is the area that I'm working. Suddenly an emergency comes up, you shrink it down, tap a guy beside you and say, you cover this area and I'll take some more of yours. Is that the way it worked?
If necessary, but normally, no, you would just keep working it and work that one, but if necessary, you could, yeah. But normally, you know, if I was working 8 airplanes and one of them had an emergency, I would keep them on the frequency and work them. But if I was having issues with other airplanes and weather, we would work something else out. But still, I had that airspace, so I really couldn't give that airplane to anybody else, because in that sector, I was working other airplanes, so I couldn't afford for that emergency aircraft to be on a different frequency. I had to have them and work them to keep them away from the other airplanes I had in there, yeah. Yeah.
I know that there's
anybody that needs to go to happy hour, feel free to get up and leave. But I love my job. I'll stay here all night and talk.
They already left.
Is there an airport that you would prefer not to be flown into?
None within the United States, no. I'd be comfortable in any of them, some more than others, but I wouldn't be uncomfortable flying in any of them. You know, Chicago was busy, and most airline pilots, I don't know how Captain White felt, but airline pilots would tell you, I'd just soon fly into Chicago in any place, because those controllers were good. They knew what they were doing. Some of them called the puppet airport, because the controllers pulled the strings and you just told them what to do. I don't know how true that is, but.
Did you know what pilots were flying which routes?
Do I know?
Did you get to know the pilots and which were on the planes on any regular basis?
I never did, no. There are just too many of them. Some of the local pilots at the smaller airports, you know, the local corporate pilots, maybe you might know, but not the airline pilots. I didn't.
Years ago, I was on an American flight, and we left O'Hare for Dallas, I believe. And we were told in flight by the pilot that they were informed by Dallas Tower we may have a bomb on board. Now, when that happened, we weren't told anything beyond that until, I don't know how many, 20 minutes later, and they said we were diverted to St. Louis. And again, we weren't told anything. And, well, it's a long story, but in effect, there was emergency landing in St. Louis, and everybody exited the aircraft by the emergency sites. But my question really is, how is something like that handed off from O'Hare to Dallas to St. Louis, and how does it affect the other aircraft if one could be exploding while others are in the same track?
Well, in the air, there was no attempt, any special attempt to provide any additional separation. It was felt that the 3 miles or more was sufficient separation in the air. On the ground, once that aircraft landed or was taken off, then you kept everybody away from that taxiway. But in the air, you took no special actions. But as far as handing off, the coordination was excellent between control facilities as you moved along and from person to person. There was hardly any break in coordination. You knew, I would know probably 5 minutes ahead of time if there was an aircraft with a suspect bomb coming into my sector. I would have been advised of that by the controllers down the line. They would have passed it along. And I would know long before I started talking to you that there was a bomb on board.
And how did they decide to divert to St. Louis versus somewhere else?
That's basically a decision made by the pilot and the company. A lot of times they'll make that decision where they have equipment. You know, maybe American didn't have a presence in Kansas City, so they didn't want to land in Kansas City. They wanted to go on to St. Louis. But normally the controllers did not make that decision. That's a decision made by the pilot and the company. And normally the company would tell them, hey, we want you to land at such and such. And then they would tell us, and then we would make it happen.
How many people will fly again?
Do the 9/11 lectures at another time. I think we'll all be here.
Yeah, and if you had mentioned that to Susan, I'd be happy to do that. Again, I'm not an expert on 9/11, don't think that I am, but I can tell you I was in the radar room in Pittsburgh when United 93 made the left turn to Cleveland and started heading to Shanksville, and telephones started ringing, and what happened after that, I'm happy to share that with you from a factual basis. But as far as what happened to the other aircraft, I have a couple good resources for you if you're interested in that, and I'll share with you one right now. They say to, give you stuff so you're always coming back, but Google Lucky Penny or Lieutenant Lucky Penny or Lucky Penny 9/11, something with Lucky Penny in it. And you'll be tied to your computer for the next hour. Lucky Penny was an F-16 pilot at Andrews Air Force Base on 9/11. Female pilot. I forget what her real first name is, but all these jet jockeys, they all have magic first names, nicknames, if you've seen Top Gun, same thing. Well, her last name was Penny. So, obviously, her call sign was Lucky. Lucky Penny. She was sitting in the break room in Andrews Air Force Base. She was our operations officer. She was doing some paperwork on 9/11, and her squadron leader came in and said, Lucky, get your flight suit. We're going flying. And they had no armament. You know, they were on training missions at that time. Now we have airplanes on standby that have missiles and all that. At that time, you know, it was never thought of. So they had a couple airplanes sitting out there, but they had no guns, they had no missiles, they had anything. Squadron leader said, Penny, get your airplane. We're flying, and there's an aircraft headed for DC. We don't know what he's going to do when he gets here, but we're going to get airborne. So Lucky and her squadron commander ran out there to the airplane, and she goes on to this in great detail for an hour. I encourage you to Google that. The essence of the story is, she'll tell you, we got out in our airplanes and we got no guns or anything, what are we going to do? And they made a pact, her and the squadron commander. He said, I'm going to take the cockpit, you take the tail. And if that aircraft would have gotten through to DC, that's what they would have done. They would have crashed that airplane. One of them would have taken the cockpit, one the tail. But Lucky Penny, Google it, I'm sure you'll find it. You'll sit there for an hour, and it's very interesting. She does a very good job telling the story. And she'll also tell you that her father was a United Airline pilot who flew the East Coast. And she didn't know where he was that day. And so she could have been taking down his airplane. But it's worth Googling and watching it. But, okay. Anybody else? Anybody want to buy me a beer?
All right.
Okay. Thank you.